A new report warning about the collapse of a critical water source for the western United States has ignited fresh anxiety across North America. At nearly the same moment, British Columbia revealed that negotiations tied to the massive Columbia River Treaty had been suspended after Washington announced a review of its international commitments. Then came another political shockwave. Donald Trump, returning to the center of American politics, began speaking openly about Canada's enormous freshwater reserves. Trump described millions of gallons flowing south from Canada's snow-covered regions, portraying the country as if it controlled an enormous valve feeding the continent. Few observers imagined that one of the fiercest confrontations between Ottawa and Washington in 2026 would center on water, yet that is exactly what is beginning to unfold. While headlines remained fixed on tariffs, trade disputes, and Trump's repeated comments about Canada potentially becoming the 51st state, another crisis was quietly growing beneath the surface. Prime Minister Mark Carney eventually drew a hard line that stunned even veteran diplomats. He warned that Canadian freshwater resources would never become part of any negotiation with the United States, regardless of how severe America's drought emergency might become. What makes the situation so volatile is that the scenario no longer feels impossible. A decade earlier, the idea that Washington could someday view Canada's rivers and lakes as a strategic necessity would have sounded absurd. In 2026, however, the concept suddenly appears disturbingly realistic. The reason is simple. The figures emerging from the American Southwest are becoming impossible to dismiss. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, has repeatedly hovered near record lows. During years of prolonged megadrought, the reservoir dropped more than 170 feet below full capacity. Meanwhile, the Colorado River continues supplying nearly 40 million Americans, spread across 7 states and Mexico, even as water flow remains far lower than planners during the 20th century originally expected. Cities such as Phoenix and Las Vegas are now preparing for a future where emergency restrictions may become permanent reality instead of temporary responses. Across California's Central Valley, farmers overseeing one of the planet's most productive agricultural zones have already watched thousands of acres turn dry as groundwater supplies collapse and irrigation expenses spiral upward. That growing pressure began reshaping Trump's language after his return to power. At first, the remarks sounded like casual commentary regarding Canadian resources. But over time, the rhetoric evolved into something far more serious, especially as climate fears intensified throughout Western American states, dependent on shrinking reservoirs to sustain massive populations, huge farming networks, and trillion-dollar economic systems. Trump and several allies increasingly started presenting Canada not merely as a neighboring ally or trade partner, but as a nation holding resources the United States might someday require to endure an increasingly hotter century. Even without formal policy demands, the tone itself triggered alarm inside Ottawa. Canadian leaders understood the danger that emerges when geopolitical influence collides with scarcity of essential resources. Then came the exchange that transformed rising tension into an international headline. During a White House meeting with Trump in May 2025, Mark Carney directly told the American president that Canada was never for sale and would never become available for sale under any circumstance. His statement was a direct rejection of Trump's repeated suggestions regarding Canadian independence and deeper integration with the United States. Trump answered with the phrase that instantly detonated across television networks and social media platforms in both countries. Never say never. The impact of that moment went far beyond the words themselves. Timing made the confrontation explosive. By that stage, Canada had already entered a dramatically different political atmosphere. Trump's tariff threats, annexation jokes, and increasingly confrontational language toward Canadian sovereignty had sparked a nationalist backlash that rapidly transformed the country's election environment. Carney entered office sounding less like a conventional diplomat seeking quiet compromise behind closed doors and more like a leader preparing Canada for an era where defending strategic resources could define an entire generation of politics. Among every resource under discussion, one stood above all others: water. Canada controls roughly 20% of the world's freshwater reserves when renewable lakes and river systems are counted together. What once sounded like an interesting geographic fact suddenly began resembling a geopolitical power. The country contains more than 2 million lakes, along with immense river systems stretching across several provinces, and freshwater basins so enormous they resemble inland seas when viewed from space. The Great Lakes alone hold approximately 21% of the planet's surface freshwater volume. Together, the surrounding economic activity connected to both Canada and the United States in that region supports an economy estimated near $6 trillion. Any serious discussion involving North American water access therefore becomes economically explosive, environmentally dangerous, and politically radioactive at the same time. For many Americans enduring worsening drought conditions, however, the idea increasingly sounds practical rather than hostile. Advocates supporting cross-border water sharing frequently argue that Canada possesses massive freshwater abundance, while large portions of the United States face structural shortages that could persist for decades. Policy organizations and infrastructure experts have revived old concepts involving giant pipelines, continental diversion systems, and massive engineering projects capable of redirecting northern water toward drought-stricken American regions. Some of those proposals date back many decades. Several envisioned colossal networks rerouting water from Canada and Alaska into dry western states through thousands of miles of canals and pipelines. In earlier eras, such visions collapsed because the financial cost appeared completely unrealistic. Today, those economics no longer seem quite as impossible. As water insecurity threatens entire regions, discussions that once sounded like science fiction are being reconsidered with growing seriousness. And that exact shift is what deeply worries Canada. Officials fear that once conversations evolve from theoretical debate into long-term infrastructure planning, the political pressure surrounding Canadian freshwater resources could become permanent. The concern inside Canada runs far deeper than a normal trade disagreement because the United States is not simply another nation requesting commercial access. It remains the largest economy on Earth, Canada's primary trading partner, and a geopolitical giant capable of applying overwhelming pressure during negotiations whenever strategic interests are involved. For many Canadians, the danger begins the moment freshwater stops being viewed as a protected public asset and starts being treated like an export commodity. Once that transition happens, they believe real control slowly slips away through trade agreements, investment regulations, and international legal obligations. In Ottawa's eyes, the first pipeline would never truly remain the last one. That is why Mark Carney has consistently described the issue using the language of sovereignty instead of pure economics. The distinction changes everything. Canada is no longer discussing water the same way it debates oil, lumber, or natural gas. Increasingly, freshwater is being framed as a matter tied directly to national security. Government officials and environmental organizations warn that once water becomes fully commercialized, political leaders lose the freedom to protect ecosystems or prioritize domestic emergencies whenever international contracts begin overriding national discretion. To millions of Canadians, exporting freshwater southward feels dangerously close to allowing another country influence over Canada's environmental destiny itself. Those environmental fears are not hypothetical. Several regions across Canada are heating at almost twice the global average rate, while Arctic zones are warming even faster. The consequences are already disrupting glaciers, snowpack levels, wetlands, fisheries, and river networks relied upon by millions of people along with vast ecosystems. Scientists have repeatedly cautioned that freshwater systems once considered stable are becoming increasingly unpredictable as climate change alters rainfall patterns and accelerates evaporation. Massive diversion projects could intensify those pressures in ways researchers still do not fully understand, particularly across interconnected watersheds, where shifting water levels in one location can create ripple effects, extending hundreds of miles outward. That explains why resistance inside Canada has become deeply emotional rather than merely political. For countless Canadians, water is connected directly to national identity itself. This feeling is especially powerful in provinces shaped by enormous lakes, major rivers, fishing industries, hydroelectric infrastructure, and Indigenous communities whose histories along these waterways stretch back centuries. The debate no longer feels like a routine argument over resources. To many citizens, it feels existential. Canadians increasingly believe they are confronting a defining question about whether future generations will retain authority over their own environment or gradually lose that control piece by piece under mounting economic pressure from a much larger neighbor. At the same time, fear continues spreading across the United States because the drought emergency keeps intensifying. Researchers studying the Colorado River Basin have described the previous 2 decades as among the driest periods seen in at least 1,200 years based on tree ring reconstruction evidence. The long-term outlook remains highly uncertain as temperatures continue climbing year after year. The American Southwest is no longer confronting what can be dismissed as a temporary dry cycle. Instead, the region is facing the possibility that modern population expansion and agricultural development were built upon water expectations that no longer align with climate reality. That realization is rapidly reshaping political attitudes surrounding water policy throughout the United States. What makes the standoff between Canada and America even more difficult is that both nations genuinely believe their positions are logical. From the American perspective, the argument appears brutally straightforward. If climate change is permanently reducing water availability across enormous sections of the country, then refusing even to discuss access to one of the world's largest freshwater reserves begins looking reckless instead of respectful. That logic becomes even more persuasive when politicians point toward the economic damage already unfolding throughout the Southwest. Declining water supplies are threatening agriculture, residential development, power generation, and industrial expansion all at the same time. In places such as Arizona and Nevada, some government officials have already delayed or blocked certain new construction projects because long-term water availability can no longer be guaranteed with confidence. Yet from Canada's viewpoint, the exact same conversation carries an entirely different meaning because history shapes every aspect of this relationship. For decades, Canadians have lived beside a neighbor vastly larger in both economic and geopolitical influence. American economic gravity affects nearly every sector of Canadian life, from manufacturing and defense to energy exports, trade relationships, and national policy decisions. That history created a deeply rooted instinct inside Canada to protect anything still viewed as unquestionably under Canadian authority. Freshwater sits near the top of that list. Many Canadians fear that once investors, corporations, and politicians begin viewing freshwater as a continental commodity rather than a protected national resource, the balance of power could permanently shift. Economic dependence, they believe, has a way of quietly evolving into political dependence over time. Those fears intensified dramatically as Trump's broader rhetoric toward Canada became increasingly aggressive. His repeated references to Canada eventually becoming the 51st state may have sounded theatrical or exaggerated to portions of the American audience, but north of the border, the reaction was far more serious. The comments landed during a period when Canadians already felt vulnerable because of tariff threats, economic instability, and uncertainty surrounding future trade relations. Mark Carney immediately recognized that national mood. That is precisely why his response focused so heavily on permanence and ownership rather than temporary bargaining tactics. When Carney declared that Canada was not for sale, his message extended far beyond territory alone. He was speaking about control over strategic resources during an era when climate pressure is beginning to reshape global politics itself. The deeper irony beneath the entire confrontation is that both countries are already profoundly connected through shared water systems, whether they want to admit it or not. The United States and Canada are already deeply tied together through enormous cross-border water systems managed jointly for more than a century. Agreements, such as the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty, established mechanisms for resolving disputes involving shared rivers and lakes long before climate change emerged as a global emergency. Across both nations, millions of people depend on the very same waterways for drinking supplies, shipping routes, fishing industries, hydroelectric energy, and industrial production. The Great Lakes region, by itself, supports tens of millions of jobs, alongside some of the continent's largest industries dependent on freshwater access. So the debate is not really about whether the two countries are interconnected. That reality already exists. The true conflict centers on whether existing cooperation should eventually transform into direct resource transfers on a dramatically larger scale. And that difference matters enormously. Once massive export systems are established, reversing them later could become politically impossible. Environmental specialists frequently warn that water infrastructure creates permanent momentum of its own. After governments invest tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars constructing diversion projects and giant pipeline networks, entire industries and communities begin relying on those systems indefinitely. That is exactly what Canada fears. Officials in Ottawa worry that what begins as temporary emergency cooperation could slowly evolve into a permanent expectation reinforced by political lobbying, legal obligations, and economic pressure from the most powerful economy on the planet. From the Canadian perspective, even a small concession today could eventually trap future governments inside agreements they no longer fully control. Beneath the public debate lies another uncomfortable reality. Politicians rarely discuss openly: climate migration. As regions across the world become hotter, drier, and increasingly unstable, countries rich in fresh water may become some of the most strategically valuable territories on Earth. Viewed through that lens, Canada's geography suddenly appears far more significant. The country possesses immense freshwater reserves, vast hydroelectric capability, lower population density, and enormous northern territory likely to remain relatively cooler as climate conditions worsen elsewhere. Canadian leaders understand that international demand for water security could rise dramatically over coming decades. That is why conservation is increasingly being described not simply as environmental policy, but as a form of long-term national defense. Meanwhile, public opinion on both sides of the border continues hardening. Following the Trump and Carney meeting, Canadian social media erupted. Clips featuring Carney's declaration that Canada was not for sale spread rapidly across digital platforms and generated enormous online reaction. Several Reddit discussions tied to Trump's remarks regarding Canadian resources attracted thousands of responses from users, warning that freshwater could become the next major geopolitical battlefield. Internet reactions are often exaggerated, but this time they exposed something important. Ordinary citizens increasingly believe the issue is real. What once sounded like conspiracy theory territory now feels plausible enough that people in both countries are emotionally invested in the outcome. And internationally, the timing could hardly be more critical, because water insecurity is rapidly emerging as one of the defining geopolitical issues of the century. The United Nations has repeatedly warned that billions of people may experience water stress conditions during the coming decades as industrial demand, population growth, pollution, and climate disruption intensify simultaneously. Around the globe, governments are already clashing over rivers, dams, and underground aquifers crossing national borders from Africa to Asia. Analysts who once used the phrase water wars cautiously now discuss it openly inside policy and security circles because the strategic importance of fresh water becomes more obvious every single year. That broader global context explains why Canada's position has attracted so much international attention. By refusing to describe fresh water as a standard export commodity, Ottawa is essentially attempting to establish a principle before future pressure becomes overwhelming. Canadian officials recognize that if powerful countries begin openly treating freshwater reserves as tradable strategic assets, nations rich in water could face dramatically increasing political and economic pressure throughout the next several decades. Holding the line now may prove far easier than trying to reclaim authority later after global expectations have shifted. Still, none of this means cooperation between Canada and the United States is impossible. In fact, many experts believe the future relationship between the two nations will depend less on confrontation and more on whether North America can rethink the entire way it manages water resources. That could mean larger investments in desalination systems, recycling technology, agricultural efficiency, reservoir modernization, leak reduction programs, and climate adaptation infrastructure, before extreme scarcity forces governments into more desperate political decisions. Some cities have already demonstrated that aggressive conservation strategies can sharply reduce per-person water consumption without destroying economic growth. Those examples prove alternatives to continent-wide water transfers do exist if governments are willing to spend enough money and maintain long-term political discipline. But those solutions demand enormous investment, patience, and coordination, and that is exactly why this moment feels so dangerous. Climate pressure is accelerating faster than many governments can adapt. Every passing year brings lower reservoir levels, heat records continue climbing, political urgency surrounding water grows more intense.